From the Good Shepherd Auditorium in Inwood, New York City, welcome to Inwood Artworks On Air. It's where we meet the musicians, filmmakers, writers, theater makers, and artists of all stripes who live here in this neighborhood that we affectionately call Upstate Manhattan. I'm your host, Aaron Sims, and today we welcome composer and musician David Friend. David is an experimental musician living in New York City here in Inwood, a classically trained pianist. He performs regularly with new music groups and is a soloist at major venues and do-it-yourself spaces throughout the city, across the country, and abroad. The New York Times describes him as, quote, one of the finest, busiest pianists active in New York City's contemporary classical scene, unquote. He has recorded for numerous labels, including the most recent release for solo piano and electronic processing, Post, for New Amsterdam Records, and with Third Coast Percussion for Sadie in an album that won the Grammy Award for Best Chamber Music Performance. He is a co-founder of Bent Duo, an interdisciplinary project with Bill Solomon that frequently explores issues of queer identity, theory, aesthetics through performance, multimedia work, and artistic collaborations. As a generative artist, his work often focuses on experimental queer traditions of availabilism, aesthetics of extremity, and the disruption of traditional hierarchies between and among artists and the public. If you're fascinated, intrigued, and interested in actually what this music might sound like, well, guess what? You're in luck. Let's go where music and can only exist where words fail, and listen now to two compositions by David Friend.
I believe in fighting violence, but got to go out and beat up a pig or something. Go out and beat up a... Go out and beat up a... Go out and beat up a pig. A pig. Beat up a pig. Beat up a pig. Beat up a pig. Men are oppressive. They just oppress you in all different ways. I, as a person, don't believe that a transvestite or a woman should do all the washing, do all the cooking, and do everything that was forced on by the bourgeois society and the establishment that women have to do this. I, as a person, a transvestite, a woman.
Well, there you have it, folks. David, thank you so much for being here, and welcome to Inwood Artworks On Air.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm glad this is finally happening.
I know. I've just so long story short is like continually checked in with David throughout the years in the pandemic saying, hey, we're trying to do something, keep the dream alive here. And schedules have never matched up until now. So I'm glad we finally got you.
Yeah. And I mean, isn't that the way things happen in the art world, right? All the near misses, and then the stars align. So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And we just heard two pieces and one a brand new piece, as we were talking off camera a little bit before earlier off audio. So could you tell us what we just listened to?
Sure. So so two very different things. First of all, which in a nutshell, I guess kind of summarizes to a certain extent kind of my life as a musician. Lots of different things. The first piece is actually part of a bigger project that is a piece of my work with Bent Duo. So that's a creative project with my partner, Bill Solomon. And we do a lot of interdisciplinary work, but usually with some connection to sound. And that piece is part of a bigger project called Was Here. And the concept behind the bigger project is that there are a lot of spaces in New York City, but in a lot of places that once upon a time were kind of locations for queer communities. And often these were, hidden places, or they were places that were abandoned or nobody else wanted to go to, right, for a variety of reasons. And many of these places have sort of lost that identity over the years, whether through, redevelopment, urban renewal, gentrification, all these different sorts of reasons. And the idea of this project essentially was to go to some of these lost queer community spaces and create like little wormholes back into that kind of connect you with that past. So this piece was part of the first iteration of that project, which happened at the Christopher Street Pier, which is now a absolutely gleaming, sparkling waterfront park with yoga classes, free yoga classes and all this kind of stuff. But used to be this like literally falling into the Hudson, decaying, abandoned commercial pier, which because really no one had any interest or use for it, became this space where queer people could gather and could sort of have their own space that they weren't harassed by the police, and so what we did was we created these pieces that kind of channeled the pre-existing energy of that space, and we made these short pieces. So the audio you heard also has a visual component. And what we did is we essentially created QR codes. And we distributed them around the space. And when we sort of opened the piece, we were there in person and just sort of handing out like not a lot of info, just sort of like this QR code, right? So anybody who happens to be curious and use their phone gets this little wormhole, which in the case of this piece, you hear the very angry, right?
Yeah.
Very
like harsh
angry
distortion.
Right. Like, text from, which is an archival recording of Sylvia Rivera speaking, who is one of the, sort of legendary queer activist and was one of the people present at the Stonewall riots, et cetera, and who actually lived on the pier for a period of time, was homeless for off and on for years, and it channels that element of rage that was part of that community space, right? That it was a safe space because it was abandoned, right? Like at the time, this feeling that like the only safe spaces, right, for a lot of queer people at that time were spaces that nobody else was around, right? So it was tapping into that part of it. And other pieces of that iteration of the project are not all channeling the anger element, but that one in particular does sort of plug into that.
Starts off that way, but I have to say too that's like there's among it there's some brighter spots within the piece too. I have to say that's nice. You can't have one without the other, I think. And so, but well, what an amazing concept. And can people still find the QR code somewhere down on the pier right now?
Go check it out.
All right. I love it.
Yeah. And it is kind of, I don't know, the mysterious quality is sort of part of the project. Like we want people to stumble across it, and
Yeah.
and that really is the only way to access, aside from this podcast, okay, special access. That really
right.
is kind of the only way to access those pieces, is like through these little
You need to give me
wormholes
the
that we're leaving
JPEG of
behind.
the QR code to put on the screen for the video version of the podcast. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
But well, that's a great story. That's a really, really great story. Because I think that piece, because I could only take it on its own. I haven't gone the full journey. But it's funny. It's like I feel like it does, because I was trying to catch a lot of the sampling too, and it does explore, I feel, gender and identity, and perhaps a sense of belonging.
Yeah, 100%. And I think also it's part of that is sort of built communities, chosen families, all of that kind of stuff. But chosen families about people, but also so often community involves space as well, right? So it's this concept of availabilism, which I think runs a course through a lot of sort of queer, creative, and artistic practices, which is like, well, I have this because nobody else wants it. Yeah. Right? Or this is the thing that's devalued, right? So if you think about like drag artists, right? So often it's this center of their practice is taking something that is not valued, like, oh, it's so tacky, right? Or it's so cheesy, or it's terrible, it's got whatever, and then really figuring out a way to celebrate that and making it something that is, sort of that transcends itself. So I think with the way that we constructed that piece, there are elements of that too. There's really harsh sound, right? And there's also really sort of unadulterated sound, just sound that's, captured, that could be thought of as like noise, right? Not pristine necessarily, but then using those as building blocks to create something that has a unified, or anyway, a meaningful aesthetic, right? That kind of, transcends those rough elements.
Yeah, and you have that piano underlying too there that kind of either it could take you ascending or descending depending how you're feeling, it carries such an emotional alarm with it.
Yeah. Well, good. I'm glad.
Like that. Well, I mean, I'm not trying to. I'm not telling anybody what to think either. By the way, I'm just saying it's like I'm just playing off of what you're kind of giving me the box set version of like the real into it, and so just kind of like because I can only respond to it on a sonic level.
Sure.
And so
Well, and that's also part. I mean, it's great to hear.
The context is just added to me now. I'm thinking of that, and it's like that's what it's giving me from that.
Yeah, and it's cool to talk about it as well, because I mean, I think thinking of the bigger project, we really do sort of want it to be, for the average person who is going to, see a QR code, be curious, and just there is no context really. Yeah. And yet in the creation of it, there is this much broader context. So the day that we were physically present, and we were, in addition, to our sort of longer sneaky plan of having the QR codes around, we literally, were just sort of, as you would like a flyer you don't want necessarily, right? Like for that, you're just,
I've been that guy.
You take it, you know what I mean?
No,
so it's like just not a whole lot of info or whatever. And then it was really interesting to see people's response, because a lot of people, were just sort of hanging out or whatever because it is a park now, right? So it wasn't just people quickly passing by on their way to whatever. And a lot of people, who kind of circled back around and found us and were like, hey, let's talk about that. Or, you know what I mean?
I need to talk about this.
Right. Or who had a strong, they had thoughts about it and they wanted to share them, or they had questions and they wanted to be like, who was talking, or what prompted this? Is this part of that kind of thing? So it's been interesting. I love that feedback, and I love giving space to people to have whatever response they have, right? Like, I don't want to I'm personally not so interested in creating creative space where people have a really clear guideline about I should be feeling this, I should be thinking this. You don't have to validate
something true or not true.
Yeah. So
well, I'm just happy just to be able to hear about more of it from you. That's all I care about.
Great.
So And the second piece.
Sure. So the second piece, yeah,
Totally,
totally different.
Cue
right?
the opera singers.
Yeah, and it right, and so welcome to my life, right? Like it's just like so many like seemingly disparate things that for whatever reason like all make sense to me.
But another outdoor piece.
It is another outdoor piece in that sense. It is there is a point of connection. Also, another I think I can say this, but another exciting thing that I haven't said to a lot of people yet. So another exclusive on the podcast maybe is the project. So the big project that this is a small sample from. It premiered at Riverside Park last month, and that was amazing. It was great. But flashing lights, whatever. It's actually the piece is coming to Inwood Hill Park next month.
All right.
Yeah, and so there's going to be because the terrain of the space is so different, it will be slightly different, but essentially the same work. Site specific, different sites, so it will change a little. But we're coming to Inwood which is really exciting.
Yes.
Yeah, so the big project is called Capacity, and it is it's a bunch of people who came together. So Melissa Riker, who has Kinesis Dance Project, who is also an Inwood resident, and a brilliant choreographer. She and her dancers, who often do public work, in public places, they did the choreography for this piece, which it's just so interesting because it's like it is happening in a public place, but it's also kind of this like mobile, like the piece moves across space, and it just it's this. Really turned into this remarkable thing that came together. And then there's music, and the music is composed by 4 people actually. So it's not just all my music, who are all affiliated in some way with a New York-based group called Antisocial Music, who also the instrumental performers are Antisocial Music people, and then there are singers as well who are part of Opera on Tap. So Kinesis Dance Project and Antisocial Music and Opera on Tap were the big sort of organizational elements that brought this together. And it's just like an amazing constellation of people that turned into this I went to both performances in Riverside Park, and even though I'd been in the rehearsals and I, wrote some of the music and, I'd really seen it come together, it really just it was this amazing experience, where it just hypnotized people, and you just had all of these people just, sort of moving through this park together, transfixed by this movement that was happening, and it was really remarkable. So I'm really glad that it's coming to Inwood, and I was really happy to be a part of it. So the audio, you only heard the audio, right? I'm talking about the whole project. My contribution was this audio part, and I guess probably the most relevant thing I can really provide some context is that when I was talking with Melissa as the piece was coming together, she was really interested in the work of this geologist who had been studying the way that rocks crack, and this not all of a sudden necessarily, but, these deep geological things that happen over the span of, hundreds and thousands of years. Yeah, fissures and the pressures, all of the forces that are involved with that. And this particular geologist who, through her research, had sort of upended some thinking about the processes as they unfold that had been accepted, for a long time. And thinking about that geologist's work, and then also thinking about on a personal human level, the kind of pressures that so many of us and so many of our relationships have been under through the pandemic, through all of this, right? And this idea of intense pressures that sometimes lead to what seem like sudden, right, explosive fissures, right? Or extreme pressures that slowly change the shape of things or make a space that wasn't there before. And so that's sort of hearing her talk about her interest in that and how that was playing out in the choreography really got me thinking about all of those concepts as well. And so the approach I took with this piece was really to give the individual performers a lot of agency. So I created sort of a system for each of them to, in a way, to sort of create their own part. So I did not tell them exactly play exactly these notes in this order at this time, but I sort of created a structure where each of them could use some elements that I provided and then think through some personal elements that touched on these concepts of like geology and personal loss and stuff. And I really couldn't have been more happy with the way it came together. I mean, they're amazing performers, and it also turned out to kind of coincide with the way that the dancers were working with the choreography. So it just became this sort of like really rich collaboration and really, I think, meaningful. People were really caught up in it. So
Well, you got me excited about it. I can't wait to see it. That was the best answer I've heard anything yet today.
Oh, wow.
I mean,
great.
that was just, I mean, my point is like, it's just, wow, it's just invigorating. And it's, nothing better than people being engaged and wanting to see something.
Absolutely.
And experiencing it. There's nothing better than that.
Yeah, and I think what Melissa does is so amazing because, in the art, so often we hear about it and we hear about it in public conversations, but, artists often hear about it sort of in, backstage conversations too about, the need to engage audiences and we're losing audiences or, all this kind of stuff. These conversations have been going on for decades at this point, right? Yeah. But then, with like Melissa's work, it's like, it really turns that myth, right? That there's sort of this downward slope of, broad cultural interest in the arts, and more and more people are becoming less and less reachable, right? With what we think of as like capital A art or whatever. Mm-hmm. Because Melissa's starting essentially with no audience, right? She's delivering these pieces in spaces that are not built, right, to have a conventional audience, and also that are going to be filled with people who are there for other reasons. And yet even in that space, like this work is really connecting with people, both with people who are specifically interested in it and show up, for the performance, but then also for like a broad array of people. I mean, literally, like there's someone who was jogging and they're in, sweating and whatever, and have just like stopped, at whatever point they see, and I've just continued on with it.
I've done outdoor drama. I've done outdoor Shakespeare. I told you, those are the best moments where the kids are riding through on their bikes and they're stopping. They're literally in their tracks.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, jogging, same thing.
Right.
It's so invigorating. And for however much time you have them, it's a gift.
Yeah. And I think it really, to me, it's sort of, it proves, not that I'm, trying to prove to anyone but it proves, right, that it isn't this sort of, it isn't this fact of nature or something, right? That the arts are this ivory tower thing that you have to make some kind of accommodation, right, for the broader public
it's accessible.
Right. It is. That's not. That isn't necessarily true, right? Because it does engage people. There are other things at play maybe that makes it feel inaccessible at times, but it's not inherent.
Dance is not for them.
Right.
Classical music is not for them.
Right.
Those instruments look shiny and expensive.
Right.
A piano is really big. I can't afford that.
Right. And so, I think a lot of the time the onus is put on on, the meat and the potatoes of the dance or the music or the theater or whatever. And I think a lot of times it's actually everything else. It's the trappings, right? It's like not feeling comfortable walking into that theater space, because you've never been in a space like that before, or not feeling like, oh, I don't know how to behave, right? I don't know when to clap. I don't know when to, all that kind of stuff. And it's not necessarily the art itself, right? Because good art is transcendent, right? It transcends, depending on the art. It can transcend language. It can transcend class. It can transcend all of these things. So I think work, really creative work like Melissa's is like, it's an amazing sort of proof of concept of that.
Yep.
Right?
And just so you guys know, if you don't know who Melissa Riker is, you can go back in our catalog and find our podcast with Melissa Riker, talking all about her work with Kinesis and also Estrogenius and Dance Rising and all the other wonderful projects she has going on here, and now also in Inwood. I'm just super jazzed that you guys got to collaborate and your neighbors.
Yeah.
How cool is that?
It's amazing. And, it's so... because Opera on Tap and Antisocial Music are not Inwood specific organizations, right? And so actually we didn't know that until we were well into the thick of it. And then I don't even quite remember how it came up, but it was like, oh, you live in Inwood?
We got getting on the train together, maybe? I don't know.
Well, it wasn't a conversation, and I can't remember what the touchstone, but it was like, wait, where do you live? And then it was like, oh, we're neighbors.
Folks, this is why I bet the farm on creating my company, because I was like, it's all about champion local artists and cultivating a local arts going audience, because they're here, folks.
Yeah.
Like, they're here, and David and Melissa are just, two more examples of it.
Which farm did you bet? Dykeman Farmhouse?
Yes, not that. I'm gonna say that one. Yeah, but not that one. But well, thank you for. I mean, both two wonderful. By talking about the pieces, you also just kind of open up a whole, idea of your process too, and larger ideas informing the music and why the music exists, and also your process of talking and so to speak, music directing, conducting with the artists, and because at the end of the day, I feel like we get. In the arts, it's so much by rote. It's very much there's kind of like not every they really try, they being the world, because it's commodified, and it's like it's easier to put things in boxes and show you this is how it has to be done, kind of thing, and buy the books from NTI and go to the musical kind of thing. That's why I have to do it, and I really appreciate both you and Melissa's aesthetics, and I understand because I know hers and yours, having worked with you both, and just really wonderful idea of saying it's about how it exists today in this time, in this space, for these people right now as it exists. It's not for something else. It's for this moment. And as you kind of say, the trappings can be as exciting about why you're here now, that's keeping you here now, because not everyone responds to the same things all the time. So I think it's really fascinating to me. So thanks.
Yeah, exactly that. And I'm glad it's resonated. And when, Bent Duo, when Inwood Artworks had the gallery space in what's now the temporary library,
Right.
and that's a great example of this. I'm on a soapbox now, apparently, but this idea, right, that so often you hear, which is like, and very much to your credit, like I've never heard from you at all, which is like, maybe, oh, it's a free event. Oh, it's part of a community, space, whatever. Like, you can't play that, right? Oh, that's too difficult, right? That one and it's like, we played many of the same pieces that like a week later, we then went and played at Harvard Art Museum, for the most rarefied audience, right? And the concert in Inwood, people were totally into it.
Oh, totally. And we got to go right there right now, because I wanted to turn my attention to it, and I'm going to zoom out, then I'm going to zoom in on that concert, actually.
Sure.
Because with Bill Solomon, we mentioned him earlier, but just making sure his name is said again, give him full credit. And I mentioned the word interdisciplinary before to describe the work by the project. And, this can be interpreted broadly and applied to the sound of the music, of course, but the way the bent duo music makes me feel, it's tell me if it's fair to consider that the description is more applicable to the sense of like how a visual artist uses like found art to kind of and perhaps raw materials too, kids' toys, whatever, etc., and incorporates their textures along with traditional and electronic instrumentation to contribute towards a more aesthetically diverse yet more complete sound.
Yeah. Wow. That was so well stated. I mean, I think, yes. So,
okay, we're done here, folks.
so yes, I think you really nailed it. And just to sort of, to put that in the context of events, I guess, is, both Bill and I are like conservatory trained musicians. We played together for years as professional musicians, in New York, freelancing, making our living playing music, in conventional concerts with established ensembles, right? And that's great, and absolutely nothing wrong with that. And anyone who is in the position to make their living, right, like playing music, is the stars have aligned. Yes, you have to work hard and all that, but also you need a lucky break somewhere. So, but we both also had this growing over the years. We had this growing space of things that we were interested in, right? Things we were thinking about, things that types of music that we both in structure and in sound and in aspects of collaboration that we weren't getting asked to do, right? Like we weren't getting hired to, play any of the types of pieces we played in this Inwood concert, right? The types of artists that we've worked with since starting this group, like we would never have been in a position to collaborate them if we hadn't. So starting Bent Duo was really about facilitating a space where all of those ideas that you really eloquently stated, that there was a space for that to happen, right? Yeah. And when we just sort of did it, it was amazing what did start to happen, because it was like, okay, in a sense, maybe we sort of had a laundry list of this like pent up, like, oh, I've been thinking about this for a long time. Like maybe we can figure out a way to work something out, or, and it really just, it developed its own momentum. And I think, it really connected with people. Well, pretty early.
I think so too, and the one I'm going to go to, because it's like burned into my mind. It's so fun. It's so fun because it's again going back to what we're talking about. It's about the performance. It's about the actual participation of audience and performer. And you actually have a name for it, I'm sure, but I'm going to refer to it as the sock composition and performance when you guys walked around on your socks with the sandpaper like percussion, if you will.
Yeah.
But the only thing I'll mention more of it is that they didn't just walk around. There was arpeggiations. There was different sides. They were walking through the entire space, through the audience, behind the audience, not saying incorporating the audience per se, but by inviting the audience to be part of it, using the entire space. The piece took on not only a form of different sounds, because then you had different audible reactions from the audience while you were moving through that space, which became actually part of the piece. So I thought that was a really fun and also incredibly just memorable performance.
Oh, I'm so glad it struck a chord with you. And yeah, that's a great example of, this idea of so often music, the conventions, maybe the content of the music can be, wildly different, right? Like what is on the main stage at Carnegie Hall from night to night can be really wildly different, but the conventions of the audience and the performers is quite rigid, right? So one of the things that I think we've come back to very often in Bent Duo projects and also in working with other artists or playing existing work is projects that sort of disassemble that and maybe don't only draw on, and going back to this like interdisciplinary, which to be fair can mean, and in how many grant applications has it meant totally different things, right? Depending. But one of the things I think, one of the ways this sort of interdisciplinary mentality functions in bent duo's work a lot is in that fundamental structure, right? Not just creating in a structure of music, right? Performers and audience, but thinking about, okay, what if we think about, maybe it's the same content, but what if we think about it through a different lens, right? Like, what if we think about it through a movement lens, right? Like that piece, for instance, if we were on a stage and the audience was somewhere else and we kept, in our space, and the audience stayed put in their space, right? The experience of that would be like completely different, right? So thinking about that piece, like, yeah, it is a sonic piece, but what if we think about this sonic piece like through the lens of movement? If we do that, like it actually changes the piece in a way. It changes the experience of the piece, and it changes the way that we relate to the audience and the audience relates to the piece. So I think that's, it's something we've come back to again and again. And also like we now coming up, because it got rained out the first time, right. We have a project coming up in Inwood that also, sort of at its heart is about like thinking about the role of how, not us, everybody but us, right, functions in the context of a work that we create. This sort of idea of a community sound installation, like it doesn't exist without the participation of, the community or the community that comes together over the course of this piece. And so that's another way of kind of rethinking these fundamental structures that exist in music and I suppose in all forms, right? And kind of just, yeah. So,
well, and just I'm going to push you a little bit further with that. That is going to be coming up at the Ring Garden, just as a sound installation on the end of October, right?
Yes. So October 23rd. Yes, I should have specified what I was actually talking about.
See, I'm here for you. I got you.
So this upcoming also Inwood project happening at Inwood's iconic Ring Garden. Okay, in many respects, like the heart of, or one of the hearts of Inwood.
Yes, for sure.
Is something we've been working on for a few years. And so it's really exciting. It is coming together. It was supposed to have already happened, but as sometimes is the case in gardens, the weather was bad. And so it got postponed to a rain date. Yeah. So it will be happening on October 23rd from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. And as I started to sort of allude to, and maybe didn't quite get specific enough, it's a community sound installation. So it's open to absolutely anyone who wants to participate for any amount of time. You can come for 2 minutes. You can come and stay for every second of the 4 hours. And it requires absolutely no musical training or musical background, anything like that at all. The concept of the piece really, it's really a very Inwood project. And I think you can probably relate to where I was coming from as I started to kind of think through the beginnings of this piece, which is so often people say about Inwood, like, oh, it's a real neighborhood, right? Or, oh, it has a real neighborhood feel, or it's like, right? And it's like, okay, what does that mean, actually? And I think that there are a lot of false answers to that, right? And it's expanding it maybe broadly beyond Inwood. I'm sure there are other places that people talk about in this way, right? So I think like one false answer is like, it's a neighbor, it feels like a neighborhood because everybody who lives there is the same, right? Like everyone is the same ethnicity, or everyone is the same religion, or it feels like a neighborhood because, only people who kind of make this much money, right, can afford to live there, right? So it gives this cohesion through sameness, right? And that's very much not Inwood, right? Like Inwood is very diverse in all of those ways, religiously, ethnically, linguistically, in terms of economics, right? So Inwood, everybody says, has this, it's a real neighborhood, but it really isn't any. So I was thinking, okay, those are false answers. So what actually then is the tangible thing that people are talking about when they talk about that neighborhood feeling? And really, the more I thought about it, I kind of zeroed in on, it's really about this overlayering of these many and very varied relationships that we have, right? That, my next door neighbor who, I've seen her kid grow up, and also the person who works in the dollar store downstairs who I don't know their name, right? But I know them by sight. And if I saw them on the subway, on the other side of town, I would recognize them, right? Or the person that, I see in the park and we say hello to, but I don't know anything else about them. So it's all these different relationships that are layered on top of each other, and the way that then those interconnect between all of the people in the community. And so that got me thinking, like, that's a structure, right? So if that's a structure for a neighborhood, it could also be a structure for a piece. And so the idea with this piece, which is called The Singing Garden, is it takes that shape, okay, of all of these different and, in a sense, random, right? Because you don't know when you're going to see your neighbor, right? Like, they might be home, they might be not. You don't know when you're going to run into that person. And it takes all of those sort of micro relationships and the randomness of that, and it assign sound to that. And so basically we're making a sonic structure that is based on the community structure of the neighborhood, I think. And in the same way that the sort of neighborhood, the community that exists in the neighborhood is kind of beautiful in that, in its complexity and in its randomness. Hopefully, we'll see. Hopefully, it will be a beautiful sonic structure.
Sounds like
as
a well-structured plan to me.
And that's part of the thing. Like, we'll see. But that's really that's the concept. And so it's great. It's great that it's finally happening, and also that it is happening in the Ring Garden, which is sort of iconic. Like I said, a heart of Inwood. So it couldn't be happening in a better place.
It's our major thoroughfare, if you will. Yeah, right there. Yeah. Well, listener, do yourself a favor and take yourself to that experience on the 23rd. I hope to see you there. Speaking of going, we would like to leave our listeners with one more song. What can you share with us next, David?
Oh, sure. Okay, so the final track is from my most recent album, which is called Post. It came out on New Amsterdam Records in the spring, and it was such an exciting project to work on. The whole album is for solo piano and electronic processing. And it's a collaboration with Jerome Begin, who's a composer. He's also a very good pianist. But in the context of this project, is working as the, composing and also on the processing end of things. And what the music in this album really does is it sort of rethinks what solo piano music can be in the context of contemporary society, right? Like, we now live in a world in which even many of our most personal or important relationships are mediated in some way by technology, right? And during the pandemic, during lockdown, like, never did this become more clear, right? Where it's like, maybe you haven't seen your parents in a year, right? And the only way that you're able to communicate with them is through Zoom, right? Instead of physically going to a doctor, right? Many of us were using technology, right, to have that interaction. And so thinking about that in terms of the grand tradition of solo piano music it got us thinking, like, okay, basically everything in our life, or so much of our lives, is mediated to a greater or lesser extent by technology, and that changes all kinds of things about the way we feel about these things, about the shape of our relationships, about the way we experience, say, that doctor's appointment or that chat with our mom, right? And so what if we really explore what that means for piano music? Because even though obviously making a recording is a technological medium, right? Conventionally, when you make something like a solo piano album, what you're thinking through technologically is how to make it sound like the technology isn't there. Mm-hmm. Right? It's like, how can I make it seem as though you're sitting in a room with me, whether it's a big concert hall or it's an intimate room, and you're listening to me play the piano live. So we wanted to turn that upside down and start from the point of technology exists, right? We're not recreating or trying to recreate the experience of live performance. So if we start from that position, what does that do, and where does that lead us musically? And I think what it ended up doing, and it has been such a gratifying project, is it leads to places that are sometimes very familiar, but arrived at in an unexpected way, and sometimes to places that are really unexpected, and then cause a response that may be something that feels really beautiful, that you would not have felt that way about otherwise. And so that's sort of at the heart of the overall project. This is the first track on the album, and it's one of some of the music gets pretty crazy, and this is like, there is a lot of energy in this opening piece, and it really also starts, you can almost hear that we're starting from a point where it's almost like, okay, I'm not a scientist, but I'm going to pretend for a moment what I think of like nuclear fission or something, right? Where something is so tightly, sort of cosmically bound to each other. And then you hear it start to physically separate a little bit. And as that happens, there's just this enhancement, almost like, uncalculable enhancement of energy as you hear these two forces that start out inherent to each other pull apart from each other, and that kind of drives the piece to this point of like almost like, I don't know, extra human, extra pianistic frenzy or something like that. So it's one of my favorite tracks from the album. Yeah.
Without further ado, David Friend. These Patterns, right? That's what it's called?
These Patterns. Yep.
All right. Well, it definitely starts a pattern, and we'll see where the rest of it goes. The album's called Post, so go check it out. And David, it's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you so much for taking the time. Glad we can finally make this happen. Before we say goodbye, where can we send people to find this album and more of your work?
Sure. So you can go to my website, which is davidfriendpiano.net. For the album specifically, it's available on anywhere you would buy or listen to music, all the streaming stuff, Bandcamp, the New Amsterdam website, iTunes, all of that. And for more info about Bent Duo projects, you can check out bentduonyc.com. And I'm also on Instagram. So David Friend Gets Loud is my Instagram handle. So feel free to follow me there. And also thank you so much for having me. And also thank you for everything you do for the creative community uptown. It's really remarkable.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Well, listeners, you can find a link to David's work in the description of this podcast, okay? Thanks again, David Friend, for joining me on this Artist Spotlight edition of Inwood Artworks On Air. Hey, it's where we meet the musicians, writers, theater makers, and artists of all stripes that make their home here in Uptown Manhattan. If you have a moment right now, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts. That really does help us. Many thanks to Church of the Good Shepherd here for hosting us, and to HideSites.com for Uptown promotional support. You can support On Air and all of our programming because a lot of it's free, folks. Making a tax-free donation at inwoodartworks.nyc/donate, or do it via Venmo. Be sure to follow us on social media at Inwood Artworks to keep up with all that we do, including the Inwood Film Festival, Filmworks Al Fresco, pop-up art galleries, live performances, and so much more. And also, Inwood Artworks is proud to be supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. From the top of Manhattan and the bottom of our hearts, thank you so much for tuning in. This is Aaron Sims for Inwood Artworks On Air.